On the morning of March 14th, 1945, in the dense forests of the Rhineland, a light mist clung to the ground as the men of the 92nd Infantry Division prepared for another day of operations. The air was cold enough to turn breath into small clouds, and the smell of wet earth mixed with the acrid scent of distant artillery fire. Private First Class Samuel Hayes crouched beside a moss-covered tree, his hands working methodically on a strange contraption wrapped around the barrel of his M1 Garand rifle. His fellow soldiers watched with expressions ranging from amusement to outright mockery. Most of them believed the coming operation would be straightforward, another routine clearance of enemy positions that would end by noon. They had no idea that their assumptions about both the mission and the man beside them were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded over the next 72 hours would transform Samuel Hayes from the target of ridicule into a legend whispered about in military circles for decades, and would demonstrate that true innovation often comes from the most unexpected places. Born not from laboratories or engineering departments, but from necessity, ingenuity, and the quiet determination of a man who refused to be defined by others' limitations. Samuel Hayes had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, the third son of a metalworker and a seamstress. His father, Thomas Hayes, had spent 30 years in the steel mills, and from the age of 8, Samuel had accompanied him to work during summer months, learning the properties of different metals, how heat changed their characteristics, and how pressure and precision could transform raw materials into functional tools. His mother, Martha, supplemented the family income by repairing watches and small mechanical devices for neighbors, her nimble fingers and patient temperament teaching Samuel that the smallest components often determined whether something worked or failed completely. The Hayes household was one where education was paramount, despite the limited opportunities available to black families in the Deep South during the 1930s. Samuel's older brother, Marcus, had managed to attend Tuskegee Institute for 2 years before financial pressures forced him home. But those 2 years had been enough to bring back books on engineering, physics, and mathematics that Samuel devoured with fierce intensity. His youngest sister, Claire, often found him in the small shed behind their house at midnight, working by candlelight on some mechanical puzzle or another, his concentration so complete that he wouldn't hear her calling him for supper. When the war began, Samuel had been working at a munitions factory in Tennessee, having left Alabama in search of better wages. The factory produced various components for rifles and artillery pieces, and Samuel's natural aptitude for understanding how things worked had quickly elevated him from the assembly line to a quality control position. He learned to spot imperfections invisible to most eyes, understanding not just whether a part met specifications, but why certain tolerances mattered and how variations would affect performance in the field. His decision to enlist in 1943 had surprised his family. The munitions work paid well and kept him out of direct danger, but Samuel had grown frustrated watching white workers with half his skill receive promotions and opportunities denied to him. If he was going to face limitation and prejudice, he reasoned, he might as well face it while doing something that mattered. His mother had wept, his father had nodded in understanding, and Marcus had gripped his shoulder with a look that said he knew exactly why Samuel was making this choice. The 92nd Infantry Division, known as the Buffalo Soldiers, was one of only 2 black combat divisions in the United States Army during the war. Commanded predominantly by white officers, the division faced skepticism and prejudice from many in the military establishment who doubted whether black soldiers could perform effectively in combat. This doubt manifested in numerous ways, from inadequate training time to substandard equipment, to assignments that often seemed designed more to keep them away from critical operations than to utilize their capabilities effectively. Samuel had arrived at the division's training camp in Fort Huachuca, Arizona, in July of 1943. The heat was oppressive, the dust omnipresent, and the atmosphere among the troops was a mixture of determination and frustration. The men knew they would have to prove themselves in ways that white soldiers never had to, that every mistake would be magnified and every success diminished or attributed to white leadership. During training, Samuel had kept largely to himself, not from unfriendliness but from a habit of observation that had served him well throughout his life. He watched how weapons were maintained, how tactics were taught, and where gaps existed between doctrine and practical reality. His bunkmate, a man from Chicago named Robert Jackson, had initially mistaken Samuel's quietness for simplicity. That impression had lasted until one evening when Jackson's rifle jammed during live fire exercises, and Samuel had disassembled, diagnosed, and repaired the problem in under 3 minutes, while Jackson and the range instructor watched in astonishment. The division had shipped to Italy in July of 1944, entering combat in the Arno River Valley. The fighting was brutal, the terrain unforgiving, and casualties mounted steadily. Samuel distinguished himself not through heroics but through competence. He kept his weapon immaculately maintained, followed orders precisely, and demonstrated an uncanny ability to find covered routes through apparently open ground. Other soldiers began asking him to inspect their weapons before operations, trusting his eye more than their own. But it was in the winter of 1944, during operations in the Serchio River Valley, that Samuel first began working on what would become his signature innovation. The division had been tasked with clearing a series of small villages from German forces, operations that required stealth and precision. Standard infantry tactics called for reconnaissance patrols to identify enemy positions, followed by coordinated assaults. But German soldiers had become adept at setting ambushes, using sentries positioned to alert larger forces at the first sign of attack. The problem, Samuel realized, wasn't that American soldiers couldn't move quietly through terrain. They could. The problem was that the moment combat began, noise revealed positions and numbers, allowing the enemy to respond effectively. Artillery could soften positions, but it announced attacks hours in advance. Small arms fire, even when accurate, brought immediate response. What was needed was a way to neutralize sentries and forward positions without alerting the main enemy force. The concept of sound suppression for firearms wasn't new. Silencers had existed since the early 1900s, and various military forces had experimented with them for specialized applications. But production models were rare, expensive, and generally reserved for special operations units that black soldiers were systematically excluded from joining. Standard infantry units had no access to such equipment, and official channels for suggesting modifications or innovations were, for black soldiers, essentially non-existent. Samuel began experimenting with materials scavenged from the battlefield and requisitioned through informal channels. Metal tubes from damaged vehicles, rubber gaskets from jerry cans, steel wool from cleaning kits, and springs from various mechanical devices began accumulating in his pack. His squad mates noticed his tinkering, but mostly ignored it, assuming he was simply keeping busy during the long hours between operations. His first attempts were failures, a device that fit over the barrel but exploded on the first shot, a design that worked once but welded itself to the rifle through heat expansion, requiring an hour to remove and rendering the weapon temporarily useless, a promising prototype that reduced sound significantly but also reduced muzzle velocity so much that bullets couldn't penetrate even light cover. Each failure taught him something new about gas expansion, heat dissipation, and the complex physics of supersonic projectiles. By February of 1945, as the division prepared for operations in the Rhineland, Samuel had developed a design that showed genuine promise. It consisted of a cylindrical housing made from a lightweight aluminum alloy tube salvaged from an aircraft wreckage, internally fitted with a series of baffles constructed from folded steel mesh. The baffles were precisely spaced, each one designed to disrupt and slow the expanding gases that followed a bullet down the barrel without significantly impeding the bullet itself. Rubber washers, carefully cut from vehicle tire inner tubes, sealed each baffle chamber. The entire assembly attached to the rifle barrel through a threaded collar machined from a piece of brass piping. The threads cut painstakingly by hand, using tools Samuel had fashioned from harder steel components. The device looked crude, cobbled together from mismatched parts with visible welds and uneven finish. It lacked the precision manufacturing and clean lines of factory-produced equipment. To anyone examining it casually, it appeared to be exactly what it was: a homemade contraption of dubious functionality, the mechanical equivalent of wishful thinking. Lieutenant William Bradford, the white officer commanding Samuel's platoon, had inspected the device on March 13th when Samuel requested permission to test it. Bradford was a graduate of Virginia Military Institute, the son of a career Army officer, and a man whose views on racial capability had been formed by a lifetime in the segregated South. He held the suppressor assembly in his hands, turning it this way and that, his expression a mixture of amusement and condescension. "Private Hayes, where exactly did you learn about firearms engineering?" Bradford asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer would confirm his assumptions. "My father worked with metals, sir, and I spent 18 months in a munitions factory before enlisting," Samuel replied, his voice neutral and respectful. Bradford examined the welds more closely. "These look like something from a high school metal shop. You understand that modifying military equipment without authorization is against regulations?" "Yes, sir. That's why I'm requesting authorization to test it." Other members of the platoon had gathered around, their curiosity overcoming their exhaustion. Sergeant James Morrison, a career soldier from Philadelphia who had earned his rank through years of service, stepped closer to examine the device. Morrison was one of the few black NCOs in the division, a man who had learned to navigate the complex politics of a segregated military through a combination of competence and careful diplomacy. "Does it work, Hayes?" Morrison asked, his tone suggesting genuine interest rather than mockery. "I believe it will, Sergeant. The principle is sound. It's just a matter of proper execution." Private Robert Jackson, Samuel's bunkmate, laughed outright. "Sound principle? Sam, that thing looks like you made it from spare parts in a junkyard. No offense, but I wouldn't trust it not to blow up in your face." "None taken," Samuel replied calmly. "I've tested the structural integrity. The housing can withstand the pressure." "Withstanding pressure and actually suppressing sound are two different things," chimed in Corporal David Wilson, a man from Detroit who had worked in the automobile industry before the war. "I've seen factory-made suppressors. They're precision instruments, machined to tolerances you can't achieve with hand tools." Bradford handed the device back to Samuel. "I appreciate your initiative, Private, but we have standard equipment for a reason. Professional engineers have determined what works and what doesn't. I can't authorize you to use an untested modification in combat. It could endanger the entire unit. Sir, if I could just demonstrate, demonstration would require ammunition, which we can't spare for experiments. Request denied." Bradford's tone made clear the discussion was over. Samuel had expected this response. He carefully packed the suppressor back into his kit, his expression revealing nothing of his frustration. Jackson clapped him on the shoulder sympathetically. "Nice try, Sam, but you have to admit it's a long shot. Even if it does work a little, it won't be enough to make a difference. German sentries aren't deaf. They'll hear even a reduced shot from hundreds of yards away." The other soldiers drifted away, returning to their preparations. Morrison lingered for a moment, studying Samuel with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering his initial assessment. But he said nothing, eventually moving on to check on other members of the platoon. That evening, as Samuel cleaned his rifle with meticulous care, he reflected on the long history of being underestimated. From childhood, when teachers had assumed he couldn't possibly understand advanced mathematics, to the munitions factory, where supervisors had been shocked when his lucky guesses about quality issues consistently proved correct, to now, when fellow soldiers assumed that his skin color somehow correlated with mechanical aptitude or intellectual capability. The pattern was so familiar, it barely registered as an insult anymore, just a constant background circumstance to be navigated. But frustration, Samuel had learned, was only useful if channeled into action. If he couldn't get authorization to test his design officially, he would need to find another way to prove its effectiveness. The upcoming operation might provide exactly that opportunity. The mission briefing had come down from battalion headquarters on March 13th. Intelligence indicated a German fortified position approximately 8 kilometers into the forest, a bunker complex that controlled a crucial crossroad. Allied forces needed that crossroad for logistics and troop movement as they prepared for larger operations further east. The position was believed to be held by approximately 20 to 30 soldiers, with prepared defenses and clear fields of fire covering all approach routes. Standard procedure would call for artillery to soften the position, followed by a coordinated infantry assault. But the bunker was of reinforced concrete construction, intelligence reported, and previous artillery strikes on similar positions had proven ineffective without direct hits, which were difficult to achieve in dense forest. Moreover, heavy bombardment would destroy the very crossroad they needed intact. Alternative approaches, including bypassing the position, had been considered and rejected. The bunker had to be taken, and it had to be taken in a manner that left the surrounding infrastructure functional. Captain Robert Henderson, the battalion operations officer, had addressed the assembled platoon leaders and senior NCOs with characteristic bluntness. Henderson was from Boston, a graduate of Harvard before the war, and one of the few white officers in the division who seemed to genuinely believe in the capabilities of the men under his command. "Gentlemen, this is going to require more finesse than force. Intelligence suggests the position has excellent observation of all direct approaches. Any assault across open ground will take significant casualties. We need to get close enough to use explosives on the bunker entrance, which means neutralizing their early warning system without alerting the main garrison." Lieutenant Bradford had studied the tactical maps spread across the field table. "Their sentries will be the key. If we can identify and neutralize them simultaneously, we might get within striking distance before they can mount an organized defense." "Exactly," Henderson confirmed, "but that's easier said than done. Coordinated sentry removal requires either exceptional timing with standard weapons, which gives them seconds to alert others, or specialized equipment we don't have. I'm open to suggestions." The discussion had continued for another hour, various approaches proposed and discarded. The consensus emerged that a night approach offered the best odds, using darkness and forest cover to get as close as possible before initiating the assault. It wasn't an elegant solution, but it was practical given available resources and the capabilities of the assigned forces. Samuel had listened to all of this through the informal network of communication that existed among the enlisted men. Officers briefed NCOs, NCOs prepared their squads, and information flowed through conversations and overhead discussions. He understood the tactical problem clearly, and he understood that his suppressor, if it worked as designed, could fundamentally change the equation. The challenge was finding an opportunity to demonstrate its effectiveness in a manner that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Unauthorized use of modified equipment in combat could result in court-martial, but inaction when he possessed a potential solution seemed equally wrong. The dilemma occupied his thoughts through the evening and into the night as he lay in his bedroll, listening to the distant rumble of artillery and the closer sounds of men preparing for the next day's operations. The decision, when it came, was almost inevitable. If official channels were closed to him, he would have to prove the device's worth through results that spoke louder than authorizations or permissions. It was a risk, but one that felt necessary. His father had once told him that sometimes you had to show people what was possible before they would believe it could be done. That lesson, learned in the steel mills of Alabama, seemed equally applicable in the forests of Germany. March 14th dawned cold and overcast. The division moved out at 0600 hours, a long column of men and equipment threading through narrow forest trails. The noise discipline was better than it had been months earlier, men having learned through hard experience that carelessness cost lives. The forest itself seemed to muffle sound, dense with undergrowth and heavy with moisture that had accumulated during the night. Samuel moved near the middle of the column, his modified rifle slung carefully across his back, the suppressor wrapped in canvas and secured in his pack. Jackson marched beside him, occasionally glancing over with expressions that mixed concern and curiosity. "You planning to use that thing?" Jackson asked quietly during a rest break, nodding toward Samuel's pack. "If I get the opportunity." "Sam," Bradford was clear. "You use unauthorized modifications, you'll end up in a stockade. Maybe. But if it works, maybe not." Jackson shook his head. "You're risking a lot on a maybe." "Most worthwhile things are maybes until someone proves them," Samuel replied. The column halted at 1000 hours, approximately 2 kilometers from the target position. Captain Henderson had established a temporary command post in a small clearing, and the various platoon leaders gathered for final instructions. Reconnaissance teams had moved ahead during the night, identifying sentry positions and observation points around the bunker complex. The news wasn't encouraging. German forces had established 6 known sentry posts in a rough perimeter around the main position, each post manned by 2 soldiers with clear lines of communication back to the bunker. Any alert from these sentries would give the garrison time to fully man their defensive positions, creating a killing zone that any assault would have to cross under withering fire. Bradford returned from the command briefing and gathered his platoon. His expression was grim as he laid out the plan. 2nd Squad, Samuel's unit, would be part of the main assault force, moving forward once the sentries had been neutralized. The actual sentry removal would be handled by 1st Squad, who would attempt to take out as many positions as possible in coordinated fashion, accepting that some alarm was inevitable. Once 1st Squad initiates, we have maybe 60 seconds before the garrison is fully alert. We'll be moving fast and hard. Keep your intervals, watch for mines, and remember your sectors of fire. Questions? Private Daniel Foster, a young soldier from Tennessee, raised his hand hesitantly. Sir, 60 seconds doesn't seem like much time to cover the distance to the bunker entrance. It's not, Bradford acknowledged. That's why we have to be ready to move the instant we hear 1st Squad engage. Every second counts. Samuel listened carefully, his mind already calculating distances, timing, and possibilities. The plan was workable, but relied heavily on speed overcoming preparation, accepting significant risk in exchange for momentum. His suppressor could potentially change that calculation entirely, allowing neutralization of sentries without alerting the main garrison, buying minutes instead of seconds. But suggesting this now, in front of the assembled platoon, would only result in another rejection. The solution came to him with sudden clarity. He wouldn't suggest anything. He would simply position himself where opportunity might arise and act when the moment came. If the device worked, the results would speak for themselves. If it didn't, well, no worse outcome would result than was already anticipated. The platoon moved forward at 1100 hours, spreading out into combat formation as they approached the operational area. The forest here was dense with old-growth trees, their trunks thick enough to provide substantial cover. Underbrush had been partially cleared, whether by German defenders or previous combat was unclear, leaving better sight lines, but also less concealment. 1st Squad moved ahead to positions where they could observe the sentry posts. The plan called for them to initiate at exactly 1200 hours, giving 2nd Squad time to reach their jump-off positions. Samuel moved with his squad, but as they settled into waiting positions, he deliberately positioned himself toward the left flank, near where one of the sentry posts had been identified. Sergeant Morrison noticed and moved over quietly. Hayes, you're supposed to be center of the line. Sarge, I can be more effective from here. Better field of fire to the bunker approach. Morrison studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. All right. But when we move, you move with us, no heroics. Understood, Sergeant. Morrison moved away, and Samuel carefully began preparing his rifle. He removed the suppressor from his pack, unwrapping it slowly to minimize noise. The attachment mechanism he had designed allowed it to be fixed or removed in under 30 seconds, threading smoothly onto the barrel. He worked by feel as much as sight, his fingers remembering the precise number of turns needed to seat it properly. Jackson, positioned 10 yards to his right, noticed what Samuel was doing and started to say something, but Samuel raised a hand in a gesture for silence. Jackson frowned but said nothing, though his expression clearly indicated he thought Samuel was making a serious mistake. Through the trees ahead, perhaps 75 yards distant, Samuel could see the position of one German sentry post. 2 soldiers were visible, positioned behind a fallen log that had been reinforced with sandbags. One was scanning the forest with binoculars, while the other appeared to be eating something, his rifle propped against the log beside him. Standard sentry behavior, complacency born of days or weeks without contact, exactly the vulnerability that good operations exploited. Samuel checked his watch. 11:57 hours. 3 minutes until 1st Squad would initiate their coordinated strike. He could hear his own heartbeat, feel the weight of the rifle with its unusual additional mass at the muzzle. sensed the attention of the forest around him, as if the trees themselves were watching. At 11:59 he made his decision. He would act first, targeting this sentry post before First Squad's coordinated strike. If the suppressor worked, the post would be neutralized silently. If it didn't, he would have alerted the enemy seconds earlier than planned, a minor change to an already risky operation. But if it worked, the implications extended far beyond this single engagement. He settled the rifle into his shoulder, the suppressor extending the weapon's length by 10 inches and changing its balance. He had practiced with this configuration during quiet moments, dry firing to understand how the additional weight affected aim, but this would be the first live fire test under operational conditions. The sentry with binoculars was the primary threat, capable of spotting movement and coordinating response. Samuel's first shot would need to neutralize him. The mechanical principles were sound, he reminded himself. The baffles would disrupt gas expansion, the rubber seals would contain pressure, and the overall design would reduce the supersonic crack that made rifle fire so distinctive. But theory and practice often diverged, especially with improvised equipment. He was about to discover which would prove true. At exactly 1200 hours, Samuel exhaled slowly, let his finger take up the slack in the trigger, and fired. The sound was unlike anything the soldiers around him had heard from a standard rifle. Instead of the sharp crack that carried for miles through forest, there was a muted pop, more like a thick branch breaking than a weapon discharging. The suppressor had absorbed and disrupted the expanding gases, reducing the report to a fraction of normal volume. The mechanical action of the rifle still produced some noise, metal moving against metal. But at 75 yards in a forest with ambient wind and wildlife sounds, it was barely noticeable. The German sentry with binoculars jerked backward, the bullet striking him center mass and causing him to collapse behind the log. His companion, startled by the sudden movement, started to turn just as Samuel cycled the bolt and fired again. The second shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him from view behind their defensive position. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. No alarm sounded. No additional enemy soldiers appeared. The forest remained as it had been, quiet except for distant bird calls and the whisper of wind through branches. It was as if Samuel's shots had never occurred, an impossibility that left the men of Second Squad frozen in confusion. Jackson was the first to find his voice. What the hell was that? Morrison was already moving forward in a low crouch, gesturing for the squad to advance. His expression was one of shock mixed with instant tactical calculation. "Hayes, you just took out that sentry post. Nobody heard it. How?" Samuel was already detaching the suppressor, needing to move quickly now that the initial element of surprise was expended. "The device works, Sergeant." "Like I said it would." "Sweet Jesus," Morrison breathed. "We need to tell Lieutenant Bradford. If you can do that to the other posts." "No time for authorization now, Sarge. First Squad is about to initiate. We need to move." But First Squad's coordinated strike never came. The squad leader, Staff Sergeant Thomas Walker, had been positioned where he could observe Samuel's engagement. Walker was a veteran of campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, a man who recognized a tactical advantage when he saw one. Instead of initiating his squad's strike, he was already moving back toward the command post at a run. Within minutes, the entire operation was on hold as word spread through the assault force that one sentry post had been neutralized without any alert being raised. Captain Henderson himself came forward to Samuel's position, accompanied by Lieutenant Bradford and several other officers. The fallen log defensive position was now occupied by American soldiers, the 2 German sentries secured and evacuated to the rear, but the main bunker garrison remained unaware that their perimeter had been breached. Henderson examined Samuel's suppressor with the eye of someone who understood engineering. "Private Hayes, I'm told this is your own design. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir. Built from salvaged materials and parts I fabricated myself." "And you've tested it how many times under combat conditions?" "That was the first time, sir." Henderson looked up sharply. "You're telling me you just field-tested an untried device in combat without authorization?" "Sir, I had tested the structural integrity and verified it wouldn't harm the weapon or the operator. The sound suppression was theoretical, but the underlying principles were sound. I felt the risk was acceptable given the potential benefit to the mission." Bradford started to speak, his face flushing with anger, but Henderson raised a hand to silence him. "Private, what you did was reckless, insubordinate, and completely outside proper channels." He paused, his expression shifting from stern to something closer to admiration. "It was also brilliant tactical improvisation that just changed this entire operation. How many rounds can you fire through that thing before it loses effectiveness?" "Unknown, sir. The baffles will degrade with heat and pressure over time, but I estimate at least 30 to 40 rounds before noticeable performance loss." Henderson turned to his officers. "Gentlemen, we have an unexpected asset. I'm revising the operational plan. Hayes, you're going to take out the remaining sentry posts one by one. We'll advance the main force under your suppressive fire once the perimeter is clear." The shift in everyone's perception was almost palpable. Minutes earlier, Samuel had been the subject of mockery and dismissal. Now, officers who hadn't known his name were listening intently as he explained the capabilities and limitations of his device. The transformation wasn't in Samuel, who remained the same competent soldier he had always been, but in their recognition of capabilities that had been there all along, waiting only for circumstances to reveal them. The revised operation commenced at 12:30 hours. Samuel moved forward with an escort of 4 soldiers, whose job was to spot targets and protect him while he fired. The forest that had seemed so threatening now became an ally, its density providing cover and concealment as they maneuvered to positions overlooking the remaining sentry posts. The second post was neutralized at 12:45, both sentries taken down with single shots before they could react. The third post, more alert and with better defensive positions, required 4 shots and took 3 minutes, but still without raising any alarm to the main garrison. Each successful engagement built confidence among the assault force and demonstrated the profound tactical advantage that silent fire provided. By 1300 hours, all 6 sentry posts had been cleared. The German bunker garrison, accustomed to their perimeter warning system, remained unaware that they were now completely isolated. American forces had moved to within 100 yards of the main position, close enough to assault with minimal exposure to defensive fire. Captain Henderson had established a forward observation position where he could see the bunker entrance. The concrete structure was impressive, built into a hillside with firing slits covering the approaches and a reinforced door providing the only visible entrance. Under normal circumstances, assaulting such a position would require accepting heavy casualties. But circumstances were no longer normal. "Hayes, can you suppress their firing positions while the assault team moves forward?" Henderson asked. Samuel studied the bunker through binoculars. The firing slits were narrow, perhaps 4 inches wide and 12 inches tall, designed to provide maximum protection while allowing defenders to engage targets outside. Hitting someone through such an opening at 100 yards would require exceptional accuracy, but the suppressor didn't affect the rifle's precision, only its sound signature. "I can keep their heads down, sir. Can't guarantee neutralization through those slits, but I can make them reluctant to expose themselves. That's all we need. On my mark, you start firing at the slits. Assault team, you go the moment Hayes opens up. Fast and hard to the door, plant the charges and get clear." "Questions?" The assault team, led by Sergeant Morrison, shook their heads. They had rehearsed bunker assaults in training, but never under conditions where the defenders would be suppressed by fire they couldn't hear or locate. The psychological advantage was enormous. "Execute," Henderson ordered. Samuel began firing at the bunker's firing slits in measured cadence, 1 shot every 3 seconds. The rounds sparked off concrete or passed through the openings, and instantly the German defenders pulled back from their positions, unable to determine where fire was coming from or how to respond effectively. The suppressed shots provided no muzzle flash to spot, no sound signature to triangulate, nothing that their training or experience had prepared them for. Morrison's team sprinted forward, covering the 100 yards in seconds, while defenders inside the bunker struggled to understand what was happening. By the time German soldiers returned to their firing slits, the assault team had reached the dead zone directly beside the bunker entrance, where defensive weapons couldn't traverse to engage them. The demolition charges were planted and fused in under a minute. The assault team withdrew to safe distance, and at 13:20 hours the charges detonated, blowing the reinforced door inward and filling the bunker with concussive force and smoke. The assault team went in immediately behind the explosion, clearing the interior in room-to-room fighting that was brutal but brief. 23 German soldiers were captured, 3 had been incapacitated by the initial explosion, and 2 had been struck by Samuel's suppressed fire through the fighting slits. Not a single American casualty had been taken. For a bunker assault against a prepared position, these results were nearly miraculous, and every man involved understood that the outcome had hinged on a device that most of them had been mocking less than 24 hours earlier. In the aftermath, as prisoners were processed and the bunker complex was secured, Samuel found himself surrounded by soldiers asking to examine his suppressor, wanting to understand how it worked and whether similar devices could be fabricated. The welds they had dismissed as crude now seemed ingeniously pragmatic. The mismatched materials they had considered evidence of incompetence now appeared to be resourceful adaptation. The same physical object, viewed through the lens of demonstrated success rather than prejudged limitation, had been transformed in their perception. Lieutenant Bradford approached Samuel as he was cleaning his rifle, the suppressor disassembled for inspection and maintenance. Bradford's expression was complex, mixing embarrassment with grudging respect. "Private Hayes, I owe you an apology. I dismissed your work without giving it fair consideration." "You had your reasons, sir." "My reasons were based on assumptions that have been proven wrong. That's on me, not on you." Bradford hesitated, then continued. "For what it's worth, I've already recommended you for recognition. What you did today saved lives and accomplished an objective we thought would cost significant casualties." Samuel nodded, accepting the words without commentary. Recognition was welcome, but secondary to the satisfaction of knowing his work had been vindicated. The device had performed as designed, the principles had proven sound, and the methods he had developed through observation and experimentation had produced tangible results. That was what mattered. Captain Henderson appeared beside Bradford, having overheard the conversation. "Private Hayes, I need that suppressor design documented. We're sending it up to division, and I'd be surprised if it doesn't make it to higher command. This isn't just a clever field modification. This has strategic implications." "Sir, I'd be happy to document everything, but I should note that each unit needs to be individually fabricated. The materials are scavenged and adapted. There's no standardized production method. Then we'll need to teach others how to build them. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir. Given time and materials, I can teach the basic principles and techniques." Henderson smiled. "You'll have both. Consider yourself temporarily detached from regular duties for technical consultation. We're also putting in for a promotion. You're too valuable as a private." The next 3 days were a blur of activity. Samuel documented his design process, created detailed drawings showing the internal baffle arrangement, and explained the underlying physics to a steady stream of officers and engineers who arrived to examine his work. Some were skeptical even after seeing the results, questioning whether the success had been partly luck or whether conditions had been uniquely favorable, but most recognized genuine innovation when they saw it. Word of the engagement spread through the division and beyond. The story grew in the telling, acquiring embellishments and dramatic flourishes. But the core facts remained consistent. A black soldier, using hand-fabricated equipment made from salvaged materials, had developed a capability that specialized units with far greater resources had failed to field effectively. The implications extended beyond the immediate tactical advantage. On March 17th, 3 days after the bunker assault, Samuel was summoned to division headquarters. The building was a commandeered German farmhouse, its thick stone walls providing protection, and its large rooms converted to offices and operations centers. He arrived in his cleanest uniform, the suppressor device carefully wrapped and carried under his arm, expecting another technical debriefing. Instead, he found himself in a room with Colonel Raymond Hughes, commander of the 92nd Infantry Division, and several other senior officers, including 2 brigadier generals he didn't recognize. The atmosphere was formal, and Samuel stood at attention, uncertain what to expect. "Private First Class Hayes, please be at ease," Colonel Hughes said, his tone cordial. "I've been reading reports of your actions on March 14th, quite impressive." "Thank you, sir." One of the brigadier generals, A man identified by his name tag as General Albert Morrison leaned forward. "Hayes, I understand you designed and built this suppressor entirely on your own initiative, using salvaged materials and working without official authorization or technical support. Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir, I had access to tools and materials through normal channels, but the design and fabrication were done independently." "What's your educational background?" Morrison asked. "High school diploma, sir, and 18 months working in a munitions factory before enlisting." Morrison exchanged glances with his colleagues. "No formal engineering training? No technical school?" "No, sir. My father taught me metalworking, and I've always been interested in how things work. I learned by observation and experimentation." The room fell silent for a moment, the officers processing this information. Finally, Colonel Hughes spoke. "Hayes, your device has attracted attention at the highest levels. The Army's technical services are interested in evaluating it for potential wider production. We've also received inquiries from other divisions about whether you could assist with similar modifications and innovations." Samuel felt a surge of cautious optimism. "Sir, I'd be honored to help in any way I can." "Good, because we're creating a new position within the division specifically for technical innovation and field modifications. You'll be assigned to division headquarters with the rank of sergeant, working directly with our supply and ordnance sections to identify problems and develop solutions. Consider it a test program. If it works here, it may be expanded to other units." The promotion to sergeant jumping directly over corporal was unusual enough to be noteworthy. But the creation of an entirely new position, specifically for someone of Samuel's background and capabilities, was nearly unprecedented in the military structure of 1945, especially for a black soldier. General Morrison cleared his throat. "Hayes, I want to be clear about something. This assignment isn't charity or some public relations gesture. We're doing this because your capabilities have practical value that we'd be foolish to waste. You've demonstrated innovation and technical skill that's rare in any soldier, regardless of background. We need more of that kind of thinking, and we need it applied systematically rather than haphazardly." "I understand, sir. I'll do my best." "See that you do. And Hayes, document everything. Every design, every modification, every principle you apply. This needs to be knowledge that can be transferred and taught, not locked up in one person's head." The meeting continued for another hour, covering logistics, reporting structure, and expectations. Samuel would work with a small team of enlisted men and junior officers, identifying equipment problems reported from field units and developing practical solutions that could be implemented with available resources. It was, in essence, an acknowledgement that the gap between official doctrine and battlefield reality often required creative problem-solving that couldn't wait for formal channels. When Samuel finally left headquarters, the full weight of what had happened began to settle on him. 3 days earlier, he had been a private first class whose innovations were dismissed without consideration. Now he was a sergeant with a unique position and access to resources that would allow him to work on problems systematically rather than in isolation. The transformation hadn't changed who he was, but it had dramatically changed what he could accomplish. He found Robert Jackson waiting outside, having heard through the military grapevine that something significant was happening. Jackson's expression when he saw the new stripes on Samuel's uniform was one of open astonishment. "Sam, you're a sergeant. When did—" "Just now. Division created a new position for technical innovations. I'll be working out of headquarters." Jackson shook his head in disbelief. "This is incredible. A week ago, Bradford wouldn't even let you test that suppressor. Now you're jumping ranks and working for division command? Results matter more than rank or background, turns out. At least, they do when the results are dramatic enough to force people to pay attention. That suppressor changed everything, didn't it? Not just the tactical situation, but how people see you. See all of us, maybe." Samuel considered this. Maybe. Or maybe it just proved something that should have been obvious all along. Capability isn't determined by where you come from or what you look like. It's determined by what you can do and whether you're given the opportunity to do it. Over the following weeks, Samuel's new position began to take shape. He established a small workshop in a requisitioned building near division headquarters, equipped with tools and materials that, while still limited compared to a proper machine shop, were far superior to what he had worked with before. His team grew to include 4 other soldiers with relevant skills: a former automobile mechanic from Detroit, a machinist from Pittsburgh, a welder from Chicago, and an electrician from Philadelphia. The problems they tackled ranged from minor annoyances to significant operational issues. Rifle slings that wore through too quickly were redesigned with reinforced stitching and better materials. Vehicle fuel systems that clogged in cold weather were modified with improved filters. Radio equipment that failed in wet conditions was weatherproofed using available sealants and protective housings. Each solution was documented, tested, and distributed to relevant units with instructions for implementation. But the suppressor remained the centerpiece of their work. Samuel refined the design, developing standardized measurements and fabrication techniques that allowed consistent production. He trained armorers from various battalions in the construction process, creating a network of personnel who could build and maintain the devices in the field. By April of 1945, over 40 suppressors were in use throughout the division, and reports of their effectiveness continued to validate Samuel's original design. The tactical applications expanded beyond the initial sentry neutralization role. Suppressors proved valuable for reconnaissance patrols that needed to engage targets without revealing their positions. They were used by squad-level marksmen to provide supporting fire without drawing attention to friendly positions. In urban combat operations during the final weeks of the war in Europe, they allowed American forces to engage enemy soldiers in buildings without alerting defenders in adjacent structures. Intelligence officers noted that German forces began reporting uncertainty about American capabilities and numbers, unable to accurately assess threats when fire came without the normal auditory signatures. This psychological impact, harder to quantify than tactical results, nevertheless contributed to deteriorating German morale as the war entered its final phase. Samuel received official recognition in May of 1945, shortly before the war in Europe concluded. He was awarded the Bronze Star for meritorious achievement, the citation noting both his technical innovation and the tactical success it had enabled. The medal ceremony was conducted by General Morrison himself, who took the opportunity to speak about the importance of utilizing all available talent, regardless of background. Sergeant Hayes represents the kind of innovative thinking that wins wars, Morrison told the assembled soldiers and officers. He saw a problem, developed a solution, and persisted despite initial rejection. That's the spirit we need to cultivate throughout the Army, the willingness to consider ideas based on their merit, rather than the rank or background of the person proposing them. The words were progressive for their time, though Samuel recognized they represented aspiration more than current reality. The Army of 1945 remained deeply segregated, and opportunities for black soldiers to contribute beyond traditional labor and service roles were still limited. His own success was exceptional precisely because it was so rare, a recognition that brought both pride and frustration. After the war ended in Europe, Samuel remained with the division during the occupation period, continuing his technical work as forces were reorganized and redeployed. He received offers to transfer to technical services units, to attend engineering schools, and to participate in weapons development programs. The military, having discovered his capabilities, was suddenly eager to utilize them in ways that had been unthinkable before his improvised suppressor had proven its worth. He accepted a position with the Army's Ordnance Department, working on equipment evaluation and field modifications. The work was interesting and utilized his skills, but Samuel found himself increasingly aware of the contradictions in his situation. The same military that now valued his technical expertise still maintained segregated units, still limited black soldiers' advancement opportunities, and still operated under assumptions of racial hierarchy that his own success contradicted. In late 1946, Samuel received his discharge papers and returned to civilian life. He was recruited by several manufacturing companies, his military record and documented innovations making him an attractive candidate. He eventually accepted a position with an aerospace company in California, working on hydraulic systems and mechanical components for aircraft. It was skilled work, well paid, and utilized his abilities fully. But the broader questions his military experience had raised remained unresolved. How many other black soldiers had possessed capabilities that were never recognized or utilized? How many innovations and solutions had been lost because prejudice and segregation prevented talented individuals from contributing? How much had the nation handicapped itself by maintaining systems that judged people by race rather than ability? Samuel lived to see the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, the gradual dismantling of legal segregation, and the slow expansion of opportunities for black Americans in fields that had been closed to them. He watched with satisfaction as barriers fell, though he remained aware of how much resistance accompanied each change and how much further progress still needed to go. In the early 1970s, military historians began researching the contributions of black soldiers during the war, documenting stories that had been overlooked or minimized in earlier accounts. Samuel was interviewed several times, asked to describe his experiences and his innovations. He provided detailed technical information about his suppressor design, but he was equally interested in discussing the broader context of capability and opportunity. The suppressor worked because the physics were sound and the fabrication was competent, he explained to one interviewer, but it almost didn't happen because people made assumptions about what I could or couldn't do based on my race rather than on my demonstrated abilities. How many other innovations were lost that way? How many problems went unsolved because the people who could solve them were never given the chance? The interviewer, a young historian from a university in Massachusetts, asked whether Samuel felt his contributions had been properly recognized. "Recognized enough for my personal satisfaction," Samuel replied, but the larger lesson wasn't really learned. The military continued segregation for years after the war, despite having examples like mine, showing how arbitrary and counterproductive it was. Recognition of individual achievement doesn't create systemic change. That requires deliberate policy decisions and sustained commitment to different principles. By the 1980s, Samuel's suppressor design had been largely superseded by modern sound suppression technology, developed with sophisticated manufacturing techniques and advanced materials. But military historians and firearms experts continued to study his work as an example of effective field improvisation and applied engineering principles. Several of his original devices were preserved in military museums, and his documentation of the fabrication process became part of training materials on adaptive problem-solving. Samuel retired from aerospace work in 1986, having spent 4 decades in various engineering and design roles. He remained active in veterans organizations and spoke occasionally at military academies about innovation, leadership, and the importance of judging people by their capabilities rather than their backgrounds. One of his most memorable speaking engagements came at the Virginia Military Institute in 1991, the same institution that Lieutenant Bradford had graduated from decades earlier. Samuel, now in his 70s but still sharp and articulate, stood before an auditorium of cadets and faculty and spoke about the bunker assault of March 1945. The suppressor wasn't complex technology, he told them. Any competent machinist or metalworker could have built something similar if they understood the principles and had access to materials. What made it significant wasn't the device itself, but the circumstances that almost prevented it from being used. I had to prove its worth without authorization, taking personal risk because official channels were closed to me. He paused, scanning the audience. How many of you will graduate from this institution and go on to lead soldiers? Most of you, I expect, and when you do, remember that talent and capability aren't distributed according to background or privilege. They're distributed randomly, popping up in unexpected places, among people who don't fit your preconceptions of what competence looks like. Your job as leaders is to recognize that capability wherever you find it and create conditions where it can be utilized effectively. The cadets gave him a standing ovation, and several approached afterward with questions. One asked whether Samuel harbored resentment about how he had been treated, about the mockery and dismissal he had faced before proving his device worked. "Resentment is unproductive," Samuel replied. "I prefer to focus on what was accomplished despite the obstacles, and on working to reduce those obstacles for future generations. The satisfaction of proving doubters wrong is real, but it's less important than ensuring others don't have to overcome the same unnecessary barriers. In 2003, Samuel Hayes passed away at the age of 82. His obituary in the New York Times described him as an engineer, innovator, and decorated veteran whose contributions during the war had been overlooked for decades before being properly recognized. The article mentioned his suppressor design, his post-war engineering career, and his advocacy for equal opportunity in military service. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from the 92nd Infantry Division Association, the veterans organization that maintained the history and legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers. They created an annual award in Samuel's name, presented to soldiers who demonstrated exceptional innovation and problem-solving in challenging circumstances. The award criteria emphasized not just technical achievement, but the willingness to persist despite skepticism, to pursue solutions when official channels proved inadequate, and to prove capability through results. The first recipient of the Samuel Hayes Innovation Award was a young black female soldier who had developed an improved water purification system during deployment in the Middle East. Like Samuel 6 decades earlier, she had worked with limited resources and faced initial dismissal of her ideas. Like Samuel, she had persisted and eventually proven the worth of her innovation through practical demonstration. The cycle of capability underestimated and then recognized continued, though hopefully with each generation facing fewer obstacles than the previous one. The legacy of that March morning in 1945 extended far beyond a single tactical engagement or even a single career. It became a touchstone for discussions about innovation, leadership, and the recognition of capability wherever it exists. The crude-looking device that soldiers had mocked became a symbol of both the barriers that artificial limitations create and the potential that exists when those barriers are overcome. Samuel's own assessment, given in one of his final interviews, was characteristically modest and forward-looking. "I solved a specific problem with available resources and knowledge. That's what engineers do. What made it significant was the context, the assumptions people had to overcome to recognize that the solution was valid. We've made progress since then, but we haven't eliminated the underlying issue. People still make judgments based on surface characteristics rather than demonstrated capability. Until that changes completely, we'll continue to waste talent and limit our collective potential." The interviewer asked what Samuel hoped people would remember about his story. Remember that innovation often comes from unexpected sources. Remember that dismissing ideas based on who presents them rather than their intrinsic merit is both unjust and impractical. Remember that the person you're overlooking might be the one with the solution you need. And remember that proving yourself shouldn't be necessary if systems are designed to recognize capability fairly from the start. Those words, spoken by a man who had spent his life proving himself in ways that should never have been necessary, encapsulated both the triumph of his individual achievement and the ongoing challenge of creating systems that don't require such proof. The suppressor he built in the forests of Germany in 1945 had demonstrated one kind of innovation. The larger work of building a society that recognized and utilized all available talent, regardless of background, remained unfinished. But Samuel Hayes had contributed to that work, both through his technical achievements and through his persistent advocacy for judging people by their capabilities, rather than their circumstances of birth. The bunker that fell silent under his suppressed fire in March of 1945 stood as a concrete example of what was possible when talent was recognized and utilized. The decades of advocacy and education that followed were his effort to ensure that recognition became systematic rather than exceptional. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.